G'day people, I'm Sharon and welcome. Thanks to Jan for loaning me her Bernina 1100DA for these tutorials. Today I'm going to show you some stuff about rolled hems and gathering and a few other bits and pieces thrown in, but we're going to start out where we finished off with the threading video. When your left needle is threaded, take it down under the foot and over to the left. I'm going to move the knife back down to where it's supposed to be, so push it over and bring it down, and I'm hoping you'll be able to see the chaining on the machine. So I've held on to these threads and pulled above the tension dials to make sure everything's properly bedded, and as I hand wind, in here, threads are beginning to chain. So it's not very easy for me to film it, but they are beginning to chain in there. Once I know that the threads are beginning to chain, I can close the front of the machine, put the lint catcher onto the front of the machine, and get the machine operating with the foot control. And there is the chain that you will see. I'm going to take the thread around to the back, and there's a cutter. If you take the thread from the right hand side over to the left hand side, it will cut the threads off. Let's have a look at how well this machine is set up at the moment. I'm going to feed fabric in here. I do not need to lift the foot to get the fabric under there. The machine has got feed dogs far enough forward that it will grab it. The little green dots there, I would like for them not to be there, and I've just pulled on the top thread, the green one, to see if I can get it a bit tighter. And they are in fact a bit tighter there now. The machine seems to be stitching quite nicely, so we'll have a look at what things we have control over on the machine. At the top of the machine, next to the tension dial for the left needle thread, we have a dial, and this is the foot pressure dial. We go from low, which is where we would have it set, particularly if you're sewing something very stretchy so that the machine doesn't stretch the fabric as it sews. Medium is the one that you will do most often, and high if you're looking at a heavy, stiff fabric like a denim or a stiff linen. Presser foot pressure is how hard the foot that is feeding the fabric through is pressing on that fabric. Particularly with stretchy fabrics, if it's too hard, it will stretch it as it sews. It can't help but do it because it's pulling too hard on the fabric. On the other hand, you don't want it too light, otherwise the fabric will want to move around under the foot. So this is one of those things that you need to know where you need it to be for what you are sewing. And it will vary depending on the kind of fabric you're sewing. I'm going to turn the light off on the machine now because it's flickering a bit, and on this machine there is a switch on the back that I can turn off. Over on the right hand side I have got stitch length, and there is a marking between the 2 and the 3 indicating that that's the most common sort of stitch length you would use. Most of the time I would sew a bit bigger than that, and if you are sewing with a fluffy fabric like a fleecy or a polar fleece or something like that, go for a longer stitch length. You always need a longer stitch length for thick fabrics than you do for thin fabrics. These machines have a function called differential feed, and that means that rather than just having one set of feed dogs like your sewing machine does, these ones have 2. A front set and a back set that work together. When you have the differential feed set to N on this machine, both sets will be pulling just as hard as each other. If you have it set to 2, the front set will work twice as hard as the back set, And essentially that's like gathering, or at least a little bit. If you're making a coat or a jacket and you need a little bit of easing in the top of the garment and the sleeve, you may find that differential feed is enough to just give you that little bit of shape that you need at the top of the sleeve. Sometimes when you're doing a long seam on an overlocker, the seam can get a bit stretched out and look a bit wavy. By tightening up your differential feed to a slightly higher number, you can sometimes sort that out too and bring it back into flat. On the other hand, if the fabric is gathering as you're sewing and you don't want it to do that, take the differential feed down a bit lower and it will help to sort it out. When you go below N, the machine is going to start pulling harder on the back than it is on the front. So it is stretching the fabric as you sew. This is the differential feed. N is normal. It goes from 0.7 up to just over 2. This is the dial for moving your cutter. And the cutter is the piece here, and it determines how much fabric gets cut off at the top. In the instructions, we are told to move it out of the way before we change the cutter. So I'm going to take the cutter down to 1. And I need to then put the cutter back on. And let's see what it does. There is my stitching with the cutter on 1. And you can see there are loops over the edge of the fabric. People often think that's a tension issue. It's not. It's a cutter issue. I'll now move the cutter over to 2. Same thing, but with the cutter on 2. With the cutter on 2, I don't have those loops. So the place where the 2 threads meet up on the edge is much closer to the fabric. That's how it ought to be. Let's move it up to 3. I'm not sure if you can actually see it, but the fabric in there is now starting to bend. It wasn't doing that when we were on 2, but on 3 it's starting to bend. What does it mean? It means that this is another place where you need to adjust the cutting width depending on the kind of fabric that you are sewing on. If it's a really thick fabric, a heavy wool or a polar fleece or a fleece, you probably need to cut more of it off so that it doesn't overfill those loops. If you are sewing with a really lightweight fabric, you might need more fabric in there to fill the loops up. Always give it a bit of a go first before you start sewing on your garment and just see what adjustments you need to make. Loops hanging over the edge is not a tension issue, it's a cutter issue. To do a rolled hem, I have the cutter on 3. The book doesn't actually say that you need to move your cutter over to number 3. I personally like to do that. That means that the machine has got a bit more fabric to roll under and you're less likely to get little bits of fabric poking out through your rolled hem. Another thing you'll find is I don't even think to take the left needle out. Why? Because I'm lazy. I can't be bothered taking it out. And none of the books ever tell you that you can do a rolled hem with it in. So you're getting to see what a rolled hem looks like with 2 needles. There's another reason I actually like having two needles in. If you're using a very loosely woven fabric, there is every possibility that if you've only got one needle in there and you do your rolled hem and it's all finished and it's lovely, and then you put a bit of pressure on it, the whole rolled hem just pulls away from the garment. Not what I want to see happening. I need to move the chaining piece back so that the machine will roll the hem. Take the stitch length down towards 1. You can leave this on normal and change your lower looper tension somewhere between 7 and 9. So that's going to tighten up what's happening underneath it and cause the roll to happen. We still need to get the cutter to take some fabric off the side. And that is a 2 needle rolled hem. It didn't want to get onto the fabric at the beginning, so I needed to give it a bit of help to get onto the fabric, but once it was going, it's doing a good job. The red thread is basically not able to be seen on these. This is what woolly nylon looks like. It's sort of like fairy floss. When you use woolly nylon, the nature of the thread being sort of fibrous means that when you use it in the upper looper, it goes around that edge and sort of holds it and gives you a slight sheen on the edge, and it looks very pretty. However, these things are often quite difficult to get hold of now, and they cost a reasonable amount of money for something you're probably not going to use a lot of. But they're something you can think about. I think a lot of people would use them if they were making a lot of leotards and maybe bathing suits. Little hint, if you're going to use this stuff on your overlocker, tie it onto the previous thread, because it's really hard to get the fluffy knob at the end of this stuff through the hole on your looper. So by tying it through and pulling it, it works a lot easier. This is a reasonably stretchy fabric. It's also going to be one that's quite difficult to work with because it wants to roll to the right side. I'm going to feed it into the machine, and I'm always going to make sure that the machine is cutting off at least some of the fabric. It's just reached the end of the fabric, and I'm just going to help it get moving in there. So at this stage I'm just doing a rolled hem. If I turn my differential feed down, we'll have a look and see what happens. And now, as I am sewing, I'm going to stretch the fabric. So I'm going to take it from front and back and stretch it. It's going to be a bit of a pain. So when you're stretching it, you will get waves in the rolled hem. When you're not stretching it, you won't. There will be a little bit of wave if you put your differential feed down to 0.7, but until you actually pull on it, you won't get a lot. If you've got a really stretchy fabric and you stretch it a long way, this is how you get that lettuce edging that is often used on little girls' summer dresses. If when you go to move your cutter, it's getting caught on that, move the hand wheel around until the arrow meets the appropriate piece on the flywheel. If you've been doing something like a rolled hem, it's a good idea when you put the machine back to put it all back to normal and then do a short piece of sewing and just make sure you've got everything back to how it ought to be. and everything is normal. For gathering, set your cutter width to 3, set your differential feed up to 2, and your stitch length up between 3 and 4. Finally, change your needle threads, that's the yellow and green ones at the top, change their tensions to 8, I've done in this case. Make sure you are cutting off some of the fabric at the edge. The machine is gathering it reasonably well, but to add a bit more gather, if I put my finger behind the foot and stop the fabric from feeding out, make sure you pull not from the gathering, but from the chain when you get to the end. It's very hard to pull, and you can release the tensions on the needles if you like. And there's your gathering. Without the finger, with the finger behind it. If you want to make it tighter, pull up the yellow and green threads in here, and that will make it tighter. If you want to loosen it, you can pull this off onto those threads at the end. So you need to have made these threads long enough so that you can pull that off to whatever length you need it to be. Jan's machine actually came with a gathering foot, and fundamentally you do it exactly the same way, just with a slightly different foot on, and that foot will help to make the gathering more gathered, which is great. I do hope that you have enjoyed learning a bit more about this machine, and if you've got any questions, please let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you next time.